Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we begin with a question that still echoes through modern borders and economic systems. What happens when powerful nations carve up a continent, not for its people, but for its resources? To understand the Boer Wars, we have to start with the bigger picture, the imperial scramble for Africa. By the late 1800s, European empires were not just expanding, they were racing, jockeying for territory, prestige, and above all, profit. The British, the French, the Germans, each wanted their slice of the continent, not because they were feeling neighborly, but because the game of empire had new, high-stakes rules. And the prize? Control over land rich in untapped resources. Nowhere was this more evident than in South Africa. Imagine discovering not just gold, but diamonds, buried beneath the soil. To the British Empire, this wasn't just economic opportunity, it was imperial necessity. Gold meant currency stability, diamonds meant power, and so, financiers in London, imperial planners in Whitehall, and settlers on the ground all turned their attention to the mineral-rich territories of southern Africa. But conquest doesn't sell itself. You can't just march in, take over, and expect applause. So British politicians like Joseph Chamberlain polished their motives. They wrapped raw extraction in the velvet glove of ideology. They spoke of a civilizing mission, a noble duty to uplift the so-called uncivilized. But behind the speeches and the sermons was a very different story, one of strategic dominance and economic gain. This was not just about flags on maps. It was about systems, centralized rule imposed from afar, justified by myths of superiority, and powered by an economic engine hungry for resources. And with that, the stage was set. But imperial ambition has a funny way of inviting unexpected resistance. Let's move to the first real test of empire, the First Boer War. So, the British had their eyes on gold, diamonds, and dominance. But standing in their way, a group of fiercely independent settlers known as the Boers, descendants of Dutch colonists who had trekked inland to escape British control decades earlier. These weren't professional soldiers or trained imperial officers. They were farmers, but they knew the land, and more importantly, they knew how to fight for it. The First Boer War broke out in 1880, and from the very beginning, it looked like David taking on Goliath. But the Boers didn't just hold their ground, they hit hard. Their militia-style commandos didn't fight like a regular army. They were decentralized, fast-moving, and deeply familiar with the South African terrain. They knew every hill, every ravine, every blind corner that could be turned into a trap. The British, by contrast, were fighting a colonial war using textbook strategies designed for open-field battles in Europe. That mismatch became painfully clear at battles like Majuba Hill, where British troops were routed in a stunning defeat. It was more than just a military setback, it was an embarrassment. Imperial overreach, laid bare for the world to see. In the end, the British were forced to sign a treaty that gave the Boers a measure of internal autonomy. Sure, Britain still claimed nominal suzerainty, meaning they technically remained the superior power on paper, but on the ground, the Boers had won a very real and very humbling victory. This wasn't just a military loss for Britain, it was a strategic red flag, a reminder that sprawling empires, no matter how mighty, can falter when they underestimate local resolve and overestimate the power of centralized command. But if you think the British were done with the Boers, think again. Next up, the empire strikes back, and this time, the gloves come off. After the sting of their earlier defeat, the British weren't about to walk away, especially not when gold was still glinting in the soil of the Transvaal. By the late 1890s, tensions flared once again, and this time, the British Empire was determined to crush the Boer republics once and for all. At the heart of it, resources. Pure and simple, the British feared that an independent, gold-rich Transvaal could challenge their dominance, not just in South Africa, but across the entire imperial system. So they mobilized hard. This was no longer a skirmish over sovereignty, this was a full-blown imperial campaign. And it escalated fast. The British rolled in with tens of thousands of troops. They expected another quick victory. But the Boers didn't fight fair. They didn't line up neatly in red coats. They used hit-and-run tactics, blending into the terrain, vanishing before the British could react. So the empire adapted, brutally. Enter the scorched earth policy. British forces began burning boo farms, salting fields, and destroying food supplies. The goal was to starve the fighters out by targeting their support base, civilians. Women and children were rounded up and placed in camps, what we would now call concentration camps. It was a turn toward total war, where the line between battlefield and home front vanished. And yet, despite their overwhelming resources, the British struggled. Bureaucratic, slow-moving, and weighed down by hierarchy, the imperial system couldn't match the speed or flexibility of decentralized guerrilla tactics. It was like trying to catch a swarm of bees with a fishing net, technically possible, but painfully inefficient. The result? A war that dragged on for years, draining the empire financially, politically, and morally. But that's just the beginning of the cost. The real fallout was yet to come, and it didn't stay on the battlefield. Now, let's zoom in on the strategy, because this wasn't just a war of bullets, it was a war of systems. On one side, you had the Boers, outnumbered, outgunned, but fiercely mobile. Their secret weapon? Decentralization. They fought in small, agile commando units, darting across the terrain, launching surprise attacks, then disappearing into the hills. They weren't following orders from some central command post, they were acting on instinct, knowledge of the land, and a deep personal investment in the fight. Every homestead mattered, every ridgeline was a potential stronghold. On the other side, you had the British military machine, industrial, bureaucratic, and slow to adapt. Their answer to Boer mobility? Build blockhouse grids, fortified miniforts across the countryside, string up barbed wire, and set up supply chains like clockwork. They even expanded their internment system, trying to choke off the guerrilla network by targeting its civilian base. But here's the thing. No matter how precise or organized a system may be, it's still a system. And systems, by design, don't handle unpredictability well, especially not the kind fueled by local knowledge and emotional stakes. The Boers didn't just know the terrain, they lived it. And the British? They were playing catch-up in a game they barely understood. And let's talk money. This was no budget skirmish. The Second Boer War cost Britain over £200 million, a staggering figure at the time. That's not just an expense, it's a stress test on the empire itself. Taxpayers back in London were asking hard questions. Was this war worth it? Was the empire truly paying off, or was it just a costly illusion propped up by fantasy maps and fading pride? Because when a decentralized force can bleed a superpower dry, it's not just a tactical failure, it's a philosophical one. But the worst consequence of this clash wasn't tactical or economic, it was human. Let's turn now to the civilians. The ones who had no uniform, no rifle, and no say in the matter. This is where the war turns from brutal to horrifying. When the British realized they couldn't beat the Boers on the battlefield, they turned their attention to those who supported them, families, farmers, townsfolk. In an effort to cut off supplies and shelter to the guerrilla fighters, British commanders began rounding up tens of thousands of Boer civilians, mostly women and children, and relocating them into what they called refugee camps. But let's not sugarcoat it. These were concentration camps, and they weren't prepared for the scale or the suffering. The camps were overcrowded, unsanitary, and lacked even the basic necessities to keep people alive. Disease spread like wildfire, clean water was scarce, food was barely edible, medical care, minimal at best. By the end of the war, more than 20,000 women and children had died in these camps. That's not collateral damage, that's systemic failure. And yet, for a time, the British public barely knew. Enter Emily Hobhouse. She wasn't a soldier, she wasn't a politician, she was a lone British humanitarian who travelled to South Africa, witnessed the horror with her own eyes, and did something many in power refused to do. She told the truth. She documented the squalor, the malnutrition, the needless deaths, and sent her findings straight to Parliament. Her revelations caused a scandal. Suddenly, the moral high ground that Britain claimed in its imperial rhetoric crumbled beneath its feet. The idea that the empire was a civilizing force became harder to swallow when the world saw its victims starving in cages. This moment wasn't just about guilt, it was about legitimacy. It cracked the illusion that the empire's violence was always noble, that its conquests were always justified. It raised a question that still echoes today. If you need to cage civilians to win, what exactly are you fighting for? And while the war would eventually end, the damage, to lives, to trust, to imperial reputation, would ripple far beyond the borders of South Africa. Next, we'll see what came after the war, and who really gained power once the dust had settled. So, the war is over. The guns go silent, but here's where the real story begins, because victory on the battlefield doesn't always mean justice in society. In the years that followed the British victory, the Boer republics, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, were absorbed into a new political structure, the Union of South Africa. It was formed in 1910, and on paper, it looked like a unification, a fresh start, a way to rebuild. But let's be clear, this was not unity in the name of equality. This was a merger forged by imperial interests and elite deals, crafted to consolidate white rule and control the wealth buried beneath South African soil. The British got what they wanted, access to gold and diamonds, secured under a single, centralized government that answered to London. And the Boers? They got autonomy in cultural and local matters, yes, but only because they agreed to a racial order that excluded the majority of South Africans from power. Black South Africans, who made up the overwhelming majority of the population, were left out of the equation entirely. No vote, no voice, no seat at the table. The new system was built not to include them, but to control them. The groundwork for apartheid didn't begin in 1948, it was laid right here, in the wake of empire and compromise. Economically, the mining industry flourished if you were on the right side of the power structure. British financiers and Boer landowners profited enormously. Meanwhile, black labourers were subjected to brutal conditions in the mines, paid a fraction of what their white counterparts received, and forced into segregated compounds under laws designed to keep them cheap, expendable, and voiceless. So yes, the war ended. But the struggle? It was only beginning. A new system of racial capitalism had been born, one that would shape South Africa for generations. And all of it raises a deeper question. When peace is built on exclusion, can it truly be called peace? Next, we'll step back and examine the bigger picture, the cycle of empire, resistance, and the high cost of control. Now let's zoom out, because what happened in South Africa wasn't some isolated blip, it was a pattern, a template, one we've seen across continents and centuries. The British Empire, like so many before it, thrived on the illusion of order, centralized control, predictable systems, but every time it pushed out into the world, into places it didn't fully understand, it ran into something it couldn't quite conquer: human resistance. Not resistance with massive armies or high-tech weapons, but resistance built on identity, on land, on the refusal to submit. The Boers had no empire, no navy, no treasury, but they had something empires often underestimate: the will to endure. And every time an empire faces that kind of resistance, the costs start to climb, not just in money, not just in lives, but in moral capital. Because to keep control, an empire must go beyond law and into force, beyond diplomacy and into coercion. It starts building camps, censoring reports, rewriting the truth. And here's the irony: the more it clamps down, the more it reveals its own fragility. The stronger it appears on paper, the more brittle it becomes in practice. Resistance exposes the weak points, those cracks in the system that no amount of bureaucratic polish can hide. The Boer Wars weren't just a story of two sides fighting over land. They were a story about what happens when a centralized machine meets the unpredictable chaos of human defiance. And the aftermath wasn't just about territory, it was about who got to write the rules, who got counted, and who got erased. This isn't just history, it's a warning, because the systems we build to control others can just as easily control us. And that leads us to one final, haunting question: were the Boers freedom fighters or rebels? And now, we reach the question that refuses to go away: were the Boers freedom fighters or rebels? It depends on who's telling the story. To the British, at the height of their empire, the Boers were a nuisance, obstinate settlers who refused to fall in line with imperial authority. But to the Boers themselves, they were defending something sacred: independence, identity, land. And they weren't just fighting for policy differences, they were fighting for the right to govern themselves, on their terms, in their language, in their way. Now here's where it gets complicated. Because the Boers were also colonizers, their resistance wasn't about liberation for all, it was about white self-rule. While they fought against British domination, they built their own exclusionary system, one that oppressed black South Africans and laid the foundation for apartheid. So in resisting empire, they replicated its worst features. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the Boer Wars force us to confront an uncomfortable truth: that history doesn't hand out clean heroes and villains. It gives us people, flawed, driven, and shaped by the systems they live in. So when we ask, freedom fighters or rebels, we're really asking a deeper question: who decides what resistance looks like? Is it noble when you resist the crown, but evil when others resist you? Is rebellion always wrong, or does it depend on who's writing the history books? In the end, the Boer Wars weren't just a clash of rifles. They were a clash of narratives, of empires and outsiders, of ideals and hypocrisies. And that story, of power challenged, of control slipping, of the center struggling to hold, it's not just South Africa's story, it's ours too. If you found this video thought-provoking, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want more stories that go deeper than the textbooks, stick around. We've got a lot more truth behind history to uncover.